I don't know. Should I go for a bouncy, unbreakable goblin with the wellspring mage archetype to joyfully unleash chaotic magic anywhere and everywhere I go? Or should I rewrite the laws of the universe itself to be helpful to my compatriots as a Skittermander witch-warper? What do I choose? Today, I want to examine the question, which game from Paizo should you try first? Pathfinder 2nd Edition or Starfinder? And we're going to talk about the nuances of that question on today's episode of The Local Disaster Tour Guide. Hello travelers and tourists, my name is Mark and I am the Local Disaster Tour Guide. That's right, I am a storyteller who still has not found a game master willing to let me roll up a character with a theoretically infinite number of grenades of wonder. Not sure why I'm having so much trouble finding someone who's willing to put up with that. Welcome to a journey through the fantastic world of TTRPGs like Pathfinder and Starfinder, and today I'm going to talk about the question, which game should you try first, Pathfinder 2nd Edition or Starfinder? Recently, in the TTRPG sphere, a lot of people have been trying out new games, and a lot of people have been checking out some of my favorite games, Pathfinder 2nd Edition and Starfinder. Both of these are fantastic games that I have both played in and run as a game master, and I really enjoy both of these products, so I thought it would be fun to kind of talk about the differences in play expectations for Pathfinder 2e and Starfinder, so that if you're considering trying out one or both of these games, you can get an idea of what you might expect. Now, some really quick notes up front. First and foremost, when it comes to the question, which game should you try first, the answer is obviously the game that you are interested in trying. If you want to try Pathfinder 2nd Edition first, go for it. If you want to try Starfinder first, go for it. If you want to try Call of Cthulhu or Exalted, or even if you want to dive into D&D 5e. Yes, I know D&D's been in hot water lately, but when it comes to the question, which game should you try first, the clear and enthusiastic answer should always be the one you're interested in. Trying out a new game is obviously worth doing, and arguing about which game is best is kind of like arguing about which pizza place is best. I'm probably going to eat at them all eventually, no matter what. However, fans of this channel know that I am a pretty self-admitted Paizo fanboy, and I have a lot more experience with Pathfinder 2e and Starfinder, so for purposes of this conversation, I'm going to be comparing these two systems and giving you an idea of what you can expect, so that if you're trying to decide which Paizo product you would like to try, maybe you'll have a better idea at the end of this video. The other thing that I want to say before I dive into this conversation is, obviously, I am a fan of both of these games, and I think both of these games are incredibly fun to play. Please understand that I am a fan of both, and I think both are easily worth checking out. While I think both systems definitely have advantages and disadvantages against one another, understand both of them have something great to offer players, and this video should not be seen as me trying to tear down one or the other, because honestly, I think they're both good game systems. Discovering something new should always be a joyful prospect. Last thing before we dive into this conversation, if you enjoyed this video, please remember to like, share, subscribe. You can check out my free Discord and my Patreon. Both of those will be linked in the video description. And as always, the most important thing you can do is jump down to the comments section and join the conversation. Let me know your thoughts on Pathfinder 2e versus Starfinder, the strengths and weaknesses of both, and what advice you might give someone who is looking at one of these two systems as a new game that they'd like to try. Alright, let's get started. Pathfinder 2nd Edition and Starfinder are the two major tabletop RPGs that are currently actively being published by Paizo and that are available for members of the gaming community to try out. Now, Pathfinder 1st Edition is still out there, And Paizo has said they will continue to print books for that edition as long as people are interested in it. So Pathfinder First Edition is still available, but Pathfinder Second Edition is the active edition of Pathfinder from Paizo right now, and the one where you can expect new products to be available on a regular basis. Both Pathfinder Second Edition and Starfinder are tabletop RPGs, and they follow many of the conventions you would associate with other tabletop RPGs, creating characters, rolling dice, and spinning stories around a table with your friends. If you're familiar with tabletop RPGs, you already have an idea of what Pathfinder 2nd Edition and Starfinder are going to be. However, let's dive a little bit deeper. Starfinder is the older of these two products. It was published in 2017 by Paizo, and it is, according to Paizo, a space opera-style TTRPG that blends both science fiction and fantastical elements into one kind of all-encompassing RPG experience. There is a ton of stuff here. You can battle against the insectoid swarm that is reminiscent of the Zerg from StarCraft. Or you can drive around in large mechs and battle kaiju. And you can even play an elite psionic assassin. And of course, you can also engage in pitched starfighter battles among the stars. Starfinder is a system that mixes a wide variety of story types together into a large, beautiful, sometimes chaotic mess of an RPG that is a ton of fun to play. Pathfinder 2nd Edition was published 2 years later in 2019, and it is more of a typical fantasy TTRPG. If you've played Dungeons & Dragons or other similar games, then you already know the sword and sorcery style elements that you can expect in Pathfinder. Elves, dwarves, wizards, clerics, barbarians with a mighty great axe. These are the kinds of classic tropes that you expect in fantasy TTRPGs, and that is definitely something you can find in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Though I should note that Paizo does a good job of moving beyond just the stereotypical fantasy tropes associated with this type of game. And if you want to know how crazy some of their creations can be, you can check out the rapidly evolving psychic rhino beetle people known as the Kashrishi from one of their recent books. What I'm saying is, Paizo doesn't limit Pathfinder 2nd Edition to just the Tolkien-esque kind of fantasy that you might normally expect for this kind of game. Both games are in active publication and are seeing regular new releases from Paizo, though I will say that Pathfinder 2nd Edition is probably seeing the more active push by Paizo. It seems like their production schedule is a little more aggressive for Pathfinder 2nd Edition. However, you can still definitely find books for both games and expect new products for both games because both are being actively supported at this time. So that brings us to the main question for today's video. If you're trying to decide between Pathfinder 2nd Edition and Starfinder which game you would like to try first, well, which one should you choose? Or more broadly, what kind of play experience can you expect from these two games, and what are the advantages and disadvantages of playing them? Now, in this video, what I would like to do is to offer 3 major strengths of both systems and a couple of weaknesses of both systems, and help you get a little bit of idea of which one might be the best fit for your gaming table. However, before I talk about them individually, I would like to give a big picture of Pathfinder versus Starfinder, and something that I feel is applicable to this whole conversation, and that is when you are evaluating Pathfinder 2nd Edition versus Starfinder, it's kind of like comparing a professionally developed product versus a passion project. Pathfinder 2e, to me, is the very systematically and carefully developed game. It has a lot of hallmarks that you would associate with very deliberate creation. You can tell that its design was very systematic, and you can see that Paizo has been very careful in their approach to how Pathfinder 2nd Edition is developed. An easy example of this would be the relative playtest experience associated with both games. Pathfinder 2e has had a much more robust and carefully structured playtest experience throughout its entire design history, whereas Starfinder, while it has utilized some playtests, it has not done so nearly as deliberately or in nearly as structured a fashion as Paizo did for Pathfinder 2e. Pathfinder 2nd Edition is very much the more polished product. On the flip side, my takeaway from Starfinder is This is the passion project. Between these two games, if there is a game where I more consistently hear the voice of the author and more consistently detect the passion of the author, I have to say I find it in Starfinder. There is a greater degree of creative freedom in Starfinder, and it leads to a game that can be a little bit messier, but is also often very engaging and exciting because the passion of the authors comes through in the game. And when you're considering Pathfinder 2e versus Starfinder, one of the things that you might want to ask yourself is, do I want the polished professional product, or do I want the passion project of the creator? There are strengths and weaknesses both ways, but I think that is the easiest divider between the two, and the main thing that you might want to consider. Alright, let's talk specifics. Alright, first up, I want to discuss Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Though it is the newer game, fantasy TTRPGs tend to be more popular, so I think it's the better touchstone for this conversation and a better place to begin. And when it comes to Pathfinder 2nd Edition, I want to talk about 3 specific strengths that I think are worth noticing. Number 1 is something you are going to hear a lot in discussions around Pathfinder 2e. The math is tight. The mechanics of the game are tight, focused, and do what they set out to do, often very, very well. The second strength that I want to discuss is meaningful design, which is when Paizo includes a mechanic in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, quite often that mechanic is going to translate in a meaningful way because Paizo has taken the time to consider how that mechanic is going to interact with the full scope of the game. And last but not least, I want to talk about the fact that Pathfinder 2nd Edition feels like a fully developed game. Pathfinder 2e has had more books, it's had a steadier stream of content, and it just feels like there is more material available for Pathfinder 2e than there is for Starfinder, leading to a situation where you feel like you have a more fully developed game for game masters and players to engage with. Let's talk about these in a little more detail. First up, the math is tight. The mechanics of the game are, in a word, reliable. Seriously, this is important. I have been playing TTRPGs for years, and one of the things that an experienced storyteller can tell you in a lot of different games is the numbers are guidelines. I can't count the number of situations where challenge rating in a Pathfinder 1e or D&D game was not at all an appropriate reflection of what my players were going to be going up against. I have seen low challenge rating opponents decimate my players. I've seen high challenge rating opponents get steamrolled by my players, and many game masters, myself included, would say over the years that a lot of tabletop RPGs, the math is rough and you want to be aware of it, but it's not reliable. That is not true with Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Paizo has done a very good job of making a game where the math works the way it's supposed to work, level 1 to level 20, it is reliable. This is one of the most beautiful and important things about Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Once you get used to the nuance of how Pathfinder 2e plays, it plays really, really well. And when you're adding something to a Pathfinder 2e game, it's going to plug into the game properly. If Paizo releases a new level 17 monster next week and I throw that in against my players, I can reliably expect that level 17 monster to be an experience on par with other level 17 monsters in the game because the internal math of Pathfinder 2nd Edition is so well designed. Game masters everywhere rejoice. Pathfinder 2e has very tight, very well designed game mechanics, and they are extremely reliable. The second major strength of Pathfinder 2nd Edition that I think is worth mentioning is what I call meaningful design. And I want to specify here that when I say meaningful, I mean mechanically meaningful character options inside of the game. Many people over the years have observed in various tabletop RPGs that certain options or certain aspects of a given game are often unfulfilling, unsatisfying compared to other options that you can find. I remember in the very early days of Dungeons & Dragons 3rd Edition hearing designer commentary about trap feats, and it wasn't until significantly later in my gaming career that someone actually explained to me why trap feats are bad game design. It was just something I kind of accepted for a long time that now, looking back, I realize was actually detracting from the gameplay experience. When you have different elements inside of a game and one element is just clearly superior to another, it creates a situation that is frustrating for players because if you make the wrong choice, you're not going to do as well and the game's not going to be as fun. Now, that is not to say that Pathfinder 2nd Edition has achieved perfect balance between every single option inside of the game, but if you have played a variety of different tabletop RPGs, one of the things I think you will notice coming to Pathfinder 2nd Edition is the balance between different options is much better, resulting in a situation where the choices that you make for your character are more meaningful. Now, this is a rabbit trail I could chase a good distance, so I won't go into all of the nuance here, but as a good example, Pathfinder 2nd Edition has some of the best ancestry design I have ever seen in a tabletop RPG. In so many games, race or species or ancestry, whatever term you might choose to use there, oftentimes it is important when you first build your character, and then it means progressively less and less throughout the course of play. In Pathfinder 2nd Edition, the use of ancestry feats means that your choice of ancestry and even the heritages you take under that ancestry, those things are going to be relevant all the way through high-level play. And some of the most interesting choices in the game can actually be found in the ancestry options that Paizo gives us. Like, seriously, bouncy goblins. Read that feat and try to tell me it's not one of the most hilarious things you've ever read. I dare you. Paizo found a way to make ancestry, an aspect of the game that is easy to overlook, meaningful for a large spread of the game in a unique and exciting way, and there are a lot of elements of Pathfinder 2e's gameplay where that is true. I talk about this in a lot of my different videos. My players use a lot more consumable items in Pathfinder 2e than they have in any other TTRPG I've ever run, because the balance of the game does a better job of making those consumable items important. The choices you make for your character feel a lot more mechanically meaningful in Pathfinder 2e, and it is a real strength of the system. And then last but not least, especially in the comparison to Starfinder in this video, Pathfinder 2e definitely feels like a more fully developed game. Paizo did a lot of legwork building an internal game structure to Pathfinder 2e that often goes overlooked by players, but once you realize it is there, you see that Paizo has done a good job of making a system where they can plug and play new elements of the game very easily and very effectively, and that has allowed Paizo to pretty aggressively produce content for Pathfinder 2nd Edition at a pace that is kind of startling. Now, I'm a longtime gamer, so obviously I have no attachment to my money, and I will gladly throw it at whatever Paizo sends my way, but even I have to note that Paizo's publication schedule for Pathfinder 2e has been pretty impressive, especially given the fact that a large chunk of 2e's lifespan was during the pandemic, a time when you would expect production most likely to be cut back. And one of the side effects of this is Pathfinder 2e feels like a full game. There are a lot of character options, there are a ton of setting options, there's just a ton of material out there. Like, I'll be honest, at my own gaming table, I feel kind of bad because the book Secrets of Magic hasn't really gotten much use, and most of it just kind of arrived at my house at a bad time, and I haven't had a chance to bust it out, and it kind of got buried under the other content that Paizo has given me. It's not that Secrets of Magic is bad, it's just there's so much there I haven't had a chance to properly dive into it. If you're a player or storyteller who is interested in a particular concept or a particular idea for your Pathfinder 2e game, the odds that you're going to find the mechanical support for that idea are very high, and as I discussed with the previous point, the mechanical implementation of what you're trying to do is probably going to fit very cleanly and very neatly into the game as a whole. Paizo has produced a very well-rounded, fully developed, and realized tabletop RPG in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. But it should be noted that no tabletop RPG is perfect, and there are some things with Pathfinder 2e that could be a bit of a detriment for your play experience, and I do think they're worth discussing. I want to talk about the fact that Pathfinder 2e can be a little formulaic, and the classic internet complaint of the almost comically bad editing that Paizo used, especially in the Pathfinder 2e core rulebook. So up first, let's talk about editing and organization. This is a point that has probably been made too much on the internet, and may have even contributed to some of Pathfinder 2e's early bad reputation, and that is, especially with the core rulebook, Paizo's editing is just rough. And if you don't know what you're looking for, if you're not sure what you're trying to find, it can be a little hard to figure out where to go in Pathfinder 2e. Like, I honestly consider it weird. When I talk about Starfinder, I'm going to talk about the fact that Starfinder is a mess of options, but even though Starfinder is a mess of options, I can find content in Starfinder books a lot easier than I can in Pathfinder, just because of some of the questionable editing decisions that were made. Now, Pathfinder 2e has gotten better on this point, and I do think some people like to overinflate this particular complaint about Pathfinder 2e, but I do think it's fair to say, when you have a huge 600-page rulebook, if you don't take the time to organize that book well, it's going to be off-putting to players. This issue with editing and organization does actually spread beyond just the core rulebook, though. Because Pathfinder 2e is such a fully developed game, as I mentioned earlier, it has a wealth of options and a plethora of choices that you can make. And while Paizo has done some fantastic work allowing for free resources like the Archives of Nethys to be available to players, diving into the Archives of Nethys and trying to understand Pathfinder 2e if you've never played the game at all, it's going to be overwhelming because there's just so much content there. Now, I will say, for me as a game master and for the players at my table, as you get used to Pathfinder 2e, the way the system is structured, and the way Paizo developed the game, things do start to fit together very neatly, and once a proper picture forms, the game flows incredibly well. But there is definitely an editing hurdle to Pathfinder 2nd Edition that can be off-putting, and if you have no experience with Pathfinder 2e, it's probably good to start with a product like the Pathfinder 2e Beginner Box to help orient you to the game before trying to dive into the core rulebook or Archives of Nethys or some of the denser, more complex material. The other thing I'd like to talk about here, and this may be more of a game master issue than it is an issue for players, at least I don't think I've heard many of my players talk about this, but one thing I've noticed as a storyteller for Pathfinder 2e is the game is a little formulaic. Once you've been playing for a while, you start to see things coming, especially when you're sitting behind the Game Master screen. I'll give you an example. I run a Pathfinder 2e club at my local high school, and in one of the recent games, one of the players had built a new character on the Path Builder app, and they selected an item for their character that was over-leveled. The instant they described that item at the table, I knew that they had something that they weren't supposed to have. Before they ever rolled a dice, before they ever tried to deal damage, the description alone was enough to trigger a warning in my mind that they had stepped out of bounds. Now, from a game master perspective, that's actually kind of a good thing. Being able to quickly realize when something has shifted outside of the normal scope of the game, that can be advantageous, but it was also a little disconcerting to me because the item itself was relatively simple. The game tends to be structured and defined in such a way that even a relatively simple addition stuck out to me as out of place. Now, the players at the table didn't notice, so again, this is kind of a Game Master critique, but it highlighted for me an experience I've had a few times with Pathfinder 2e, that if you know the boundaries that Pathfinder has drawn around a given level or type of encounter, you can almost predict what's coming even if you haven't seen it before. You almost know exactly when to expect flying enemies. You can pretty precisely anticipate the level of defense that creatures might have against certain energies or types of attacks. The math of the game is really tight, which is good because it makes it reliable, but once you start to figure that math out, it can also become a little bit predictable. For players, I don't think this is as much of a problem, but as a storyteller, it might jump out to you, and it could impact your experience in play. But that's Pathfinder. Now let's talk Starfinder. And with Starfinder, I want to focus in on 3 major strengths. Number 1, the setting. Number 2, the creative freedom that the authors seem to have. And number 3, the prevalence of what I'm going to call standout products. So one of the greatest strengths of Starfinder is Starfinder's setting. And if you follow conversations about the TTRPG industry at large, this is probably something that is not much of a surprise. Paizo is well known for having some of the best setting writers and some of the best adventure writers in the entire gaming industry. People who don't like Pathfinder and Starfinder like the writers for Pathfinder and Starfinder, and a lot of people who would dog Paizo for 100 other issues will straight up tell you that the authors for this system are amazing. And in this particular instance, while Pathfinder's Golarion campaign setting is certainly well done, the Starfinder setting is just amazing. As a storyteller, I have never seen a better setting for a TTRPG ever. I have seen some amazing writers for TTRPGs. Some of the old writers for some of the old World of Darkness books had some amazing skill as authors, but hands down, the best setting writers I have ever seen, straight up, Paizo and the people they put on Starfinder. But one of the great things about the setting in Starfinder is it's not just well written, but it's written in a way that is very usable for storytellers. Starfinder blends a bunch of disparate elements, and though you think those elements might clash, they are brought together in such a way that it actually creates a system that can tell an incredible variety of stories. A lot of the tropes that you would associate with a game like Pathfinder 2nd Edition or other fantasy TTRPGs, you can incorporate into Starfinder and those things will work. Magical mysteries or battles against dragons, those can happen in Starfinder. You just get to take down the dragon with a laser gun. Or maybe the dragon has a laser gun, that's an option too. But a lot of the tropes you would expect from a fantasy TTRPG can flow very neatly into Starfinder, while at the same time Starfinder has a lot of those science fiction and more modern story options that don't necessarily fit in a Pathfinder 2e game. Several years ago, I was in a Dungeons & Dragons 5e campaign where the storyteller had our players dealing with the evils of gentrification. And I've just got to say that battling were-rats and gentrification felt a little weird in Dungeons & Dragons. It didn't feel right. The gentrification part of the story that's a modern concept, and it felt so out of place, it kind of threw off my enjoyment of the game. But I could totally see a story in Starfinder battling were-rats and dealing with gentrification, and it wouldn't affect me the same way. Paizo has given us an incredibly well-written setting in Starfinder that is so much more than Pathfinder in space. It combines such an array of different story options and beats into a functional system, and as a storyteller, you will find inspiration in this system, I guarantee it. And this strength in the setting of Starfinder really highlights what I think is the core strength of Starfinder as a game, and that is, it feels like a game where there is a ton of creative freedom for the game designers and authors to really try whatever they want. Like, my honest conspiracy theory is the head of game design for Starfinder at Paizo Whenever someone walks into their office and says, "Hey, I've got an idea," I think their literal response is, "That's hilarious, go for it." In the same Starfinder book, Tech Revolution, you both get a class that can control a swarm of nanites and the ability to drive around in mechs. These are two very different types of stories, and they support two very different styles of play, and yet Paizo was brave enough to try both of these. Either of those two options could have been very risky, and yet Paizo greenlighted them both, and both of them have the potential to be a lot of fun. And that is very true of almost every aspect of Starfinder. Do you want a class that is literally focused on drawing in alternate realities as a way of modifying the battlefield and achieving their goals? Hey, here's the Witch Warper. Do you want a class that is precognitive and can see the future? They're willing to try it. There are so many crazy ideas in Starfinder, and I'm constantly amazed by the new creative concepts that the authors and game designers of Starfinder keep dropping into the game. It really does seem like Paizo is a lot more willing to experiment with Starfinder, and a lot of those experiments have been very fun. Don't get me wrong, there is a lot of great ancestry design in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, but none of the ancestries in Pathfinder 2nd Edition have inspired the same level of just narrative excitement that the Skittermanders have in Starfinder. Seriously, I love the Skittermanders. They are amazing. And all of this creative freedom in Starfinder leads me to my final strength of Starfinder, which is when Starfinder has a standout product, it is a standout product. Like, I'll go ahead and say this, as a game master, the Alien Archive series for Starfinder is far superior to the Bestiary series for Pathfinder 2e. Don't get me wrong, I like the Bestiaries, they're fine, they do their job, but the Alien Archive series I frequently read just for fun. There is so much great content in the Alien Archive series. I can't even dive into all of it. I literally did a video on why I love the Alien Archives by themselves. I'll throw a link up here so you can check it out. But Starfinder is the first tabletop RPG that I can remember where I got genuinely excited every time they announced a new Alien Archive. Like, the monster books are something I actively look forward to because of how well done they are. When Starfinder strikes gold, it strikes gold. Its standout content really does jump out, it hooks you, it pulls you in, and you have a ton of fun with all of the crazy stuff that Paizo gives you. Now, I imagine at this point, hearing all of the strengths of Starfinder that I'm discussing, you can probably guess where some of the issues with this system are going to lie, and I already mentioned the first point I want to talk about here, which is Starfinder is a mess of options. When the options are good, they're great. When something jumps off the page, you're going to love it and you're going to run with it, and it is going to be amazing. And the Starship combat rules are also there. Sometimes you will hear people rag on the Starship combat rules in Starfinder, and honestly, I don't think that they are necessarily bad as far as Starship combat rules go, but compared to some of the other aspects of Starfinder as a whole, the Starship combat rules do feel a little dull. And even when you have different elements of Starfinder that individually might be very engaging, sometimes they aren't going to mix well with other elements inside of the game, and you have to figure out the balance of which elements of the game of Starfinder are going to mesh well to create a good story. And a good example here is mechs. The game designers for Starfinder have straight up said that mechs change the balance of power inside of the game, and you have to adjust the expected complexity and power level of threats to allow for your players to use mechs. Now, obviously, mechs can be a lot of fun, and I am all about punching kaiju with a mech, but that does mean that if you want to use mechs with other options inside of Starfinder, you're going to have to do some math and you're going to have to do some adjustments, and the fit might not be clean. Starfinder does tend to be a mess of options, And figuring out which options you like and figuring out which options are going to fit neatly together can be a little bit problematic. Certainly not impossible, but it is something you want to keep in mind if you dive into this game. And that's going to lead into the next issue that I have with Starfinder as a whole, and that is Starfinder is really inadequate when it comes to Game Master support. Now, last year, Paizo did improve on this point some. They released a book called the Galaxy Exploration Manual, and if you're a storyteller who is interested in storytelling Starfinder, I strongly recommend the Galaxy Exploration Manual as an early pickup to add to your collection. But as of right now, there is no dedicated Game Master support for Starfinder storytellers. And that is a little bit frustrating for me, especially when you have a game that is a little bit of a mess of options. When you have so many options running in so many directions and no clear guidance as a storyteller, how do I pull these different elements together into a coherent narrative? It can be kind of frustrating to run and run successfully. Certainly not impossible. I have run Starfinder games and had plenty of fun doing it, but I will say that the level of support for Game Masters in Pathfinder 2e is far superior to the level of support for Game Masters in Starfinder, and it is one of the major downsides of the system. And the last thing that I want to throw in on Starfinder that is a little bit of a consideration is Starfinder ends up being a little bit of a niche game compared to Pathfinder 2e. Since fantasy TTRPGs are more popular in general, games like Pathfinder 2e are a little bit easier to get into just because of the common interest. Adding a sci-fi element in Starfinder, while it theoretically broadens the type of stories you can tell, it has an inverse effect in that a lot of people just aren't interested in those types of stories, and it causes the game to be a little bit more niche. It is a bit harder to find Starfinder groups, and it might take a little bit more work to get one going. But those are my thoughts on some of the strengths and weaknesses of Pathfinder 2e and Starfinder and how they compare to one another. So, final verdict, what are my thoughts about Pathfinder 2e versus Starfinder? Well, this is one where I'm going to say the side of the Game Master screen that you sit on is probably going to influence your decision here. As a Game Master, I strongly prefer Pathfinder 2nd Edition and definitely consider it to be my favorite game. I run a lot of Pathfinder 2e, and the level of support and reliability inside of Pathfinder 2e as a storyteller is amazing. Seriously, sitting behind the Game Master screen at a Pathfinder 2e table is a fantastic experience, and it is difficult for me as a storyteller to go out to other games because, honestly, Paizo has kind of spoiled me with how well they support the Game Master in that game. However, as a player, honestly, I love both. Pathfinder and Starfinder are both games where I get very excited about creating characters and diving into the world, and I have hundreds upon hundreds of ideas spinning. Both games are very engaging from a player's perspective, and I think that as a player, if you have an opportunity to play either one, you're going to have a good time. It's the storyteller side of the screen where I feel there's a little bit more of a difference, and if you're a storyteller who is not sure about the two, I do think the general level of support is just much better for Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Obviously, Starfinder is still perfectly playable. I have run Starfinder games and they have worked. It's just a little bit of a wilder environment that can be a little more difficult to adjust to. Still, at the end of the day, I love both of these games, and I think you will probably have a good time no matter which one you choose. But the time has come for me to turn the conversation over to you. What are your thoughts about Pathfinder 2nd Edition versus Starfinder, and which one would you suggest somebody try if they want to try out a Paizo game for the first time? What are the strengths of these games? What are the weaknesses of these games? And what advice do you have for someone who might be trying one or the other or both? Jump down to the comments section and let me know your thoughts. Don't forget to do all of the other YouTube stuff, like, share, subscribe, check out Discord and Patreon. All of that goes a long way to keeping this channel running. But I would love to hear your thoughts and what you have to say about this topic. As always, thank you for being here. Thank you for being part of the conversation. Have a wonderful day.